George Carlin's American Dream is a two-part documentary directed by Judd Apatow and Michael Bonfiglio. It chronicles the life and work of the legendary comedian, and it's currently available on HBO. The documentary itself won an Emmy in 2022. George Carlin is usually on most people's top 5 dead or alive lists. He's definitely on mine when it comes to comedians, and one of those comics that make up my Mount Rushmore. I remember back in the day, one of my earliest memories of George Carlin was late high school through early college, like that time period in my life. And I used to download bits of his from LimeWire. You guys remember that? And I knew who he was by this point. I had seen him on shows like back then Bill Maher's show was Politically Incorrect, if I'm not mistaken, and had just known of him. I'm not sure if I had seen like a complete special or not, but also knew him as, Mr. Conductor from Shining Time Station. But during that time period where I was downloading bits of his and just listening to them on my iPod, or actually, I think it was pre-iPod even. It was just like a generic MP3 player, I think, at that point. But that's when I got a better understanding of his material and had a deeper appreciation for his work. And I just thought he was genius. And he had that intellectual genius mixed with having the gumption, having the fucking balls to say the things that he said, to dare to think the way that he thought and articulate it in ways that we were all thinking but didn't know how to articulate it for ourselves. And he was just one of those comics that made you think, made you question. And the documentary was dope. Judd Apatow does a really good job of putting together docs. He did a Gary Shandling's, which was great, that I think I spoke about on this podcast in the past, but had like so many comics, like the Chris Rocks, Jon Stewart's, Jerry Seinfeld's, Bill Burr's, all paying homage, telling how Carlin influenced them and helped pave the way for them, and sharing little anecdotes, those of which, had the pleasure of actually like getting to meet him before he died, and folks within his family, like his brother, Patrick Carlin, which actually died this year in 2022. But he was in it telling stories of like their childhood and growing up. His daughter gave a ton of, firsthand experiences. So the doc went over like a lot of things that I knew about Carlin, being a fan of his, reminded me of some things that I forgot about Carlin, like the fact that he grew up in New York, which how the fuck could I forget that? But he did grow up in New York City, and definitely put me onto a few things that I didn't know about him. And it was interesting to see a lot of his peers from that time period described him as someone who de-transformed into who he was. So in his early comedy career, when he was, trying to find himself and just like get gigs, he was a completely different type of comic. He was kind of hacky, I would say, by today's standards, and was kind of like playing characters on stage. Not kind of, he was playing characters on stage and kind of sort of seeing what would work. And a lot of folks described him as like going through the transition kind of backwards, where he started, putting on an act first for folks and then slowly became himself, when it's usually the other way around. Folks start, being themselves. That doesn't work. So they start putting on an act and, taking on a persona. Whereas those who knew him to be more of who we saw after that transition. He was closer to that than he was to, like the goofy weatherman characters that he would do. And once he started finding success, he definitely wasn't without his demons. He and his wife definitely lived it up. They drank a lot. They did drugs, weed and coke, I believe was like the extent of it. And as his career began to take off, his wife, took a back seat to him and his career. And she slowly became an alcoholic. And eventually she wound up getting sober, and she forbid him to do coke at home. And this is, accounts firsthand from his daughter. And she would say that he agreed to doing so, and he was true to that. And he didn't do coke at home, but he would disappear for like 2 or 3 days at a time. And he would like go on these like benders of like drinking and doing drugs and shit. And, he had this, fast money, rock star-ish type of lifestyle, and all the sort of like cliches that we're unfortunately used to seeing and hearing about from some stars. And it eventually caught up to him. He had his second heart attack and almost died. And the story behind that was he was at a Mets-Dodgers game, and he loved the Mets, by the way, which I didn't know. which is dope because I'm a Mets fan myself. Although I'm the worst Mets fan there is, because I root for them on the strength of being born and raised in Queens and them kind of being like the underdog team in New York, and I like rooting for underdogs. But I could literally only name one player on the Mets, which is Pete Alonso, and that's just because he spoke at my job once. So yeah, I'm the worst fan. Anyway, he was a Mets fan, and he was at this Mets-Dodgers game, and he started feeling like this weird like chest pain, and decided to like leave the game. And by the time he got to his limo, the limo driver had to rush him to the hospital, where he was literally so close to dying that the doctors like called his wife, told her to say her goodbyes. And it was his second heart attack, and it was just this lifestyle catching up to him, you know, the drinking, the drugs. Thankfully he lived, and I think post that time period is when we started to see the Carlin that I love begin to develop more. His wife Brenda wound up dying of liver cancer, and he said something pretty poignant during a Larry King interview, which I think makes sense to highlight for folks that have lost someone close to them and or will lose someone, which is that it's not just about the sorrow and the loss, it's also about the cherishing what you had with that person. I think that's pretty good advice. He then went on to marry again. He had a second wife, which was also part of the documentary, and told some pretty cool stories. And I wanted to share with you guys a couple clips of comics and some of the things that they had to say. There's a comic by the name of Sam J, which is hilarious. She has a special called 3 a.m. or something about 3 a.m., which was really good. But she said something really spot on when it comes to George Carlin, which is that aside from the comedy, he seemed to have a different goal, which was like pushing thinking. Like he had a goal of trying to make people think. And even me like flashing back mentally to listening to the bits that I downloaded from LimeWire or Napster, I do remember them making me think, making me question, you know, and that's one of the main things that I loved about Carlin. You know, it was bits like him riffing on education and highlighting how that's a way that the government is trying to get us to think the same, dress the same with wearing uniforms, keep us all in line, get us ready for corporate America. And then he likened it to, I remember he said something along the lines of, I can show you a clip from the 1940s where they tried to do the same exact thing, except you guys wouldn't understand it without subtitles because the narration is in German. And he was like likening it to Nazi Germany during World War II. Something like that. I probably butchered the bit, but that's like the essence of it. And another bit that stands out that I'm remembering right now was a bit about God and religion, and God being all-knowing and caring and loves you and will do anything for you and give up his son for you. But if you disobey any of the 10 rules that he wrote down, he'll stick you in a place full of fire and burning and pain and anguish for all of eternity. But he loves you. And just, you know, like highlighting like the hypocrisy within religion and things of that nature, just stuff that, again, made you think. Definitely made me think. So Sam J was spot on with saying that. And Carlin definitely appreciated the art of writing itself, and it showed in the attention to detail that came out of his bits. But Carlin himself said that he felt like an artist and a writer for the very first time when he wrote a bit called "The Planet is Fine, the People are Fucked." He said writing and crafting that bit is the first time that he became, or that he felt like an actual artist and writer. And I thought that was pretty dope. Here is a piece that comedian, writer, director Kevin Smith shared about remembering watching Carlin with his dad when he was a little kid.
Nobody was allowed to curse in our house, but George Carlin was allowed. And when he was laughing with George Carlin, Dad went away and there was Don Smith, some motherfucker I didn't know, but then my mother fucked, you know? So in those moments, I really got to see who he was and what he found funny.
I thought that was pretty cool. And my takeaway from that piece is the fact that there can be artists, not just comics, you know, it could be a comedian, in this case, George Carlin, it could be a movie, it could be a song, it could be a book, some form of art that allows you, gives you license to, and helps you connect with people in your life, whether it be a parent, a sibling, a friend, a coworker, and it's like they're so ill at what they do. They're so undeniable at what they do that it kind of disarms you as the consumer and allows a father and son, in the example of Kevin Smith, to share a memorable, life-impacting moment. The next clip I wanted to share was Seinfeld speaking about his take on a particular bit, and then Jon Stewart's take on that exact same bit.
Someone else's shit is on the table. Have you noticed that their stuff is shit and your shit is stuff? Get it off! Get that shit off of there and let me put my stuff down.
A place for my stuff is highly intellectual if you look at the skill level, the brain power it takes to break that down. That is, I don't know, maybe to some comedians that's just a observational comedy bit. To me, it's the elevation of the ordinary and the disassembling of the ordinary. And there's no better example of that than that bit.
And I like Jerry's take there because he's biased, right? Because he's known as an observational comic, does a lot of topical type bits, gets a lot of shit for it, even though he's an absolute genius at what he does. But he obviously has that bias and like that kind of like chip on the shoulder. But I loved his take on highlighting how difficult it truly is to boil something down to its most basic parts and make it as genius as Carlin did with that bit, and how he called it the elevation of the ordinary. I like that. And Jerry, if you're hearing this, you have an open invitation to come on the Spun Today podcast to speak about your writing process. Hit me up whenever you'd like. And here's Jon Stewart speaking about that same bit.
Since it seems like this lighthearted, superficial analysis of like the way people value their own belongings and how they display them and those types of things. But my shit is stuff and your stuff is shit really is the through line for the lack of empathy of people. Like even when you think about cancel culture, things like that, like my opinion is valid, but your opinion is cancel culture and bullshit. Like my thoughts are stuff and your thoughts are shit. And it's just this little bit that he did on shit you put on your dresser.
Thank you very much. Good night. And I hope I see you another time. Good night, all. Have a good time, you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
And Stewart's take on it is genius in how he takes it to another level and applies it to modern day issues and current events. And he obviously sees it through that slightly political lens because that's the cloth that he's cut from. And at the end of the day, that's the genius of great writing, great comedy, great art. It stands the test of time and is applicable in a myriad of ways. And that's what makes it so palatable to so many different types of people from different walks of life. And I want to leave you all with this quote of George Carlin's, which I definitely co-sign and appreciate. He said, quote, "It's the American view that everything has to keep climbing. Productivity, profits, even comedy. No time for reflection. No time to grow up. No time to learn from your mistakes. But that notion goes against nature, which is cyclical." End quote. And that, folks, is my little recap and review of George Carlin's American Dream, a 2-part documentary which won the Emmy in 2022, directed by Judd Apatow and Michael Bonfiglio, available now on HBO. Check it out.